1927. A printing house on West 26th Street in New York. Two police officers walk out into the afternoon, carrying the unbound pages of a book, and behind them, a fourth officer carries the zinc plates the pages were printed from. The book is called The President's Daughter. The woman who wrote it is standing in the doorway. She had been paid by the president for 6 years, in envelopes from a hometown friend, until he died in a hotel room in San Francisco, and the envelopes stopped. She was not the first. A widow in Buffalo, silenced with $500. A schoolgirl in Kentucky, silenced with a promise. A young woman in San Francisco, silenced with a written marriage. And her. 4 women, 4 secrets. 4 men who could not afford them. Which of the 4 made the man pay? Before we begin, if you love the women the American Gilded Age paid to be quiet and who were not, subscribe and stay close. Because tonight, I give the microphone back to the 4 of them who kept the receipts. There are 4 papers in this film. Each one cost a woman her whole life. Chapter 1. The Paper and the Gold. A rich man in 1870 could buy almost anything he wanted, and one of the things he could buy was the silence of a woman who had shared his bed. He bought it in the ordinary way. A lawyer walked into a rented room with a folded document and a small bag of cash, and the woman signed, and the document went into a safe, and the man went on with his life. It was a quiet transaction, repeated 1,000 times a year in the American cities of the Gilded Age, and its ordinariness is precisely why the 4 stories in this film are extraordinary. In each of them, the woman took the money, or was offered it and refused, and then discovered that the silence she had sold, or been asked to sell, was not a purchasable thing at all. It was a borrowed thing, and she called the loan due. Understand the world in which such a call was even possible. A woman in the American 19th century held her legal person in most of the states in which our 4 women lived, through a doctrine the lawyers called coverture, the Old English rule that a wife's identity was folded into her husband's, so that the 2 were one at law and the one was him. The Married Women's Property Acts had begun to chip at coverture from mid-century, New York in 1848 and 1860, other states through the 70s and 80s, but the acts changed the statute books faster than they changed the reflexes of the men who administered them. A wife might now, on paper, own property free of her husband. A mistress had no husband to be freed of, which meant, at law, she was in the odd position of being more independent than a wife. And in the world, in the parlor and the courtroom and the newspaper, of being less protected. She held whatever the man gave her, and whatever the man could be persuaded to keep giving. The mechanism the law offered her to make him keep giving when he tired of her was small and awkward. There was the tort of breach of promise, an old English cause of action that let an engaged woman sue for the injury of a broken engagement, on the theory that the promise of marriage was a contract and had value, and that a woman who had waited out her marriageable years on a man's word had lost something a court could price. The suit was ridiculed in every generation that permitted it, and every generation permitted it. It survived in most of the American states until the anti-heart balm statutes of the middle 1930s and 40s finally killed it. Between 1870 and 1935, it was the mechanism a wronged, unmarried woman could reach for, and one of the 4 women in this film reached for it, and won more money than her father had ever seen. There was a second mechanism, older, cheaper, and more chilling, and it ran in the opposite direction. It was the asylum. The 19th century had built, in every large American city, a private and public apparatus of institutions for the confinement of the insane. And the door to those institutions did not always require much more than a doctor's signature and a family's wish. A daughter who would not marry the right man, a wife who embarrassed a fortune, a mistress who knew too much, could find herself declared unwell and shut away, and the record would show only that she had gone to rest her nerves. 2 of the 4 women in this film were committed. One was let out within a week by a doctor who refused to keep her. One was kept for 45 years and died inside. The third gear was the press, and the press was, in the end, the reason any of these women had leverage at all. A mass circulation daily newspaper in the American Gilded Age was a machine for turning a rumor into a fact and a fact into a career. The Buffalo Evening Telegraph would run a widow's affidavit and shift a presidential election by a fraction of a percent. The San Francisco Chronicle and the Daily Alta California would run 6 years of a divorce trial to a public that could not stop reading. The Washington Post and every wire service in the country would run 4 days of a Kentucky congressman's cross-examination of a young woman from a Sacred Heart convent. And by 1927, a national tabloid infrastructure and a private vice squad would meet at a printing house in New York to fight over a bookkeeper's daughter's memoir. Without the press, none of the 4 had leverage. With the press, each of them had exactly 1 shot, which brings the film to its controlling image and to the 4 women who owned it. In each of the 4 cases, the woman's whole leverage against a mountain of gold was a single piece of paper. Maria Halpin had a 2-page affidavit sworn in Buffalo on the last day of October, 1884. Madeline Pollard had 10 years of a congressman's own handwriting, tied with ribbon and carried in a lawyer's briefcase into a Washington courtroom in the spring of 1894. Sarah Althea Hill had, or said she had, a single sheet of writing dated the 25th of August, 1880, bearing the signature of the United States Senator from Nevada. And Nan Britton had a book, 380 pages long, printed in New York in 1927, seized by the police, sued back, and confirmed by a laboratory 92 years after she opened it. 4 papers, 4 women, 4 fortunes. And in every one of these stories, the man believed the paper was worthless because the woman was, and in every one of them he learned otherwise. Sometimes at the cost of a career, once at the cost of a life, once at the cost of a page in the constitutional law syllabus, and once, finally, at the cost of the historical record itself. Begin, then, with the widow in the boarding house in Buffalo and the sheriff who thought $500 would be enough. Chapter 2. A widow, a sheriff, and a berth she could not use. Maria Halpin was 35, widowed, tall, French-speaking, and clerking at Flint and Kent in Buffalo when the Sheriff of Erie County asked her to dinner and would not accept no. She had come to Buffalo in the early years of the 1870s. She was, by every account, left by the neighbours and the sales clerks and the choir members of the Protestant Episcopal Cathedral of St. Paul, a lady. She spoke French. She sewed with the neatness of a woman who had once been a dressmaker for a living. She had left 2 small children with relatives in New Jersey and moved north to look for work, and had found it at a good store on Main Street. She had suitors. She lived in a respectable boarding house at 39 Swan Street, kept by a Mrs. Randall. She was, in the small measure such things can be measured in a stranger's town, doing well. The Sheriff of Erie County was Grover Cleveland, 36 years old, unmarried, a lawyer by training and a bachelor by habit, weighing something well past 250 pounds and drinking at a rate that his friends noted and forgave. He was on his way, though nobody yet knew it, to the mayor's office in Buffalo, and after that to the governor's mansion in Albany, and after that to the presidency of the United States. He was known to Mrs. Halpin. They moved in the same small circles of a small city. On the evening of the 15th of December, 1873, she was walking to meet a friend, and she met him instead, and he asked her to dinner. She refused. He pressed. She went. They ate together at the Ocean Dining Hall and Oyster House at 11 Swan Street, and afterwards he walked her the short way back to 39, and he did not stop at the door. What happened inside is the disputed hinge of the whole story, and it will be a hinge on which a presidential election eventually turns. Maria Halpin's own account, given under oath the following year, and again in sworn form in 19 days before that election, is written in a single flat sentence that has come down through the whole record. He accomplished her ruin, she said, by the use of force and violence, and without her consent. Cleveland's own account, given privately to his friends and to his campaign, was that the encounter was consensual and that she had been one of a number of men's mistress in Buffalo at the time. He did not ever deny the encounter itself. He could not. She was, within weeks, pregnant. The child was a boy, born on the 14th of September, 1874, in a small hospital wing for unwed mothers on the northern edge of the city, in a district where the good people of Buffalo did not go. Halpin was alone at the birth. There is no record of a friend or a family member at her bed. There is a record of the name she gave the boy. She named him Oscar Folsom Cleveland, for the sheriff who had fathered him, and for the sheriff's best friend and law partner Oscar Folsom, a man Halpin herself barely knew. It was a naming that was in one reading defiant, and in another reading trusting, and in almost any reading a mistake, because it laid on the birth certificate, in her own hand, a claim of paternity that Grover Cleveland would spend the next 10 years working around. He acknowledged the possibility that he was the father. He began to pay child support in cash, delivered by messenger, monthly. It was the acknowledgement that would later save him, because it let him say, correctly, that he had done the honourable thing by a woman he had never quite named. Halpin, in the months after the birth, began to drink. She said later, in her sworn account, that the drinking was grief and shame. Cleveland's friends said, later still, that she had been drinking all along. Both may have been true. What is documented is that in the winter of 1874 and the early spring of 1875, she was living in Buffalo with an infant she loved and could not always care for, in rooms she could barely afford, at a job she could not now keep. And she was drinking. And in the spring of 1875, on Grover Cleveland's instructions and with his lawyer's arrangement, men came to her door and took the child. She said, ever after, that she was seized in the middle of the night, drugged, and carried by carriage to a place she did not know. What is not disputed is that within days of the child being taken, Maria Halpin herself was inside the Providence Lunatic Asylum in Buffalo, committed against her will, without a court hearing, on the strength of a physician's signature and the wish of a family friend of the Sheriff of Erie County. That is where this chapter closes, and where the next one opens, at the wall of a private institution on the outskirts of a city that had, a year before, watched her walk to church in a good coat. Chapter 3. $500, one asylum, and a name he took from her. The infant was taken from her rooms by lawyers and physicians acting for the sheriff, and Maria Halpin found herself, in the spring of 1875, inside the Providence Lunatic Asylum in Buffalo. She stayed there for less than a week. The medical director of the asylum was a Dr. William King, a man whose professional judgment would matter twice in the story. Dr. King examined Maria Halpin, listened to her account of how she had arrived at his door, and concluded, in writing, that she was not insane and that she should never have been committed. He signed the release, and he said aloud, and later in print, that her confinement had been an abuse of power by political friends of Grover Cleveland's. And then he did the second thing that mattered. He kept the child. He and his wife adopted the boy she had named Oscar Folsom Cleveland, renamed him James E. King Jr., and raised him as their son. Dr. James E. King Jr. grew up prosperous and educated. He went to medical school. He practiced in Buffalo for a long career. He died in 1947, according to the historian who eventually pieced the whole story together, never knowing which man had actually fathered him. Maria Halpin left the asylum, hired a Buffalo attorney named Milo Whitney, and tried, through the summer of 1875, to recover the child. Cleveland's lawyers made her an offer: $500 in cash, roughly $14,000 in the money of today, in return for a signed agreement to surrender all claim to the child and to make no further demand of any kind upon Grover Cleveland. It was a settled hush payment on the classic Gilded Age model, a rich man's ordinary insurance. In the late summer of 1875, Maria Halpin took the money and signed. She left Buffalo. She moved to New Rochelle, New York, and eventually to New Jersey, and she raised her 2 older children on the interest of that $500 and on what work she could find. The leverage went into her drawer. It stayed there for 9 years. In July of 1884, with Grover Cleveland the Democratic nominee for the presidency of the United States and running as Grover the Good, the Flint honest reformer of Buffalo, a Baptist minister of the city named the Reverend George Ball, published a story in the Buffalo Evening Telegraph. The headline was, "A Terrible Tale." The body of the story alleged that the Democratic nominee had raped a widow of the city 10 years earlier, fathered her illegitimate son, had her committed to an asylum, and stolen the child from her arms. The article named Maria Halpin. It named the doctor. It named the asylum. Within a day, it was in every Republican paper in the country, and within a week, the campaign of James G. Blaine had turned it into a chant. Ma, Ma, where's my pa? In Buffalo, in Chicago, in Cincinnati, on the steps of city halls and outside every train station where Grover Cleveland was scheduled to speak. Small crowds of Republican voters would call it out at him. Cleveland's answer was the 3-word telegram that has come down as one of the most famous instructions in the history of American political consulting: tell the truth. What he meant, and what his campaign then executed, was a very careful, partial truth. He admitted the paternity because he could not deny it, because he had been paying. He admitted the affair because everybody in Buffalo already knew of it. And he denied every other element of Halpin's account, characterizing her, through his advisors and his friendly newspapers, as promiscuous and unstable, and casting the paternity of the child as genuinely uncertain among several possible fathers, including his own dead friend Oscar Folsom, for whom the boy had been named. That was the moment Maria Halpin, in a small parlor in Buffalo, signed the piece of paper that made her famous. Her affidavit is dated the 31st of October, 1884, 4 days before the election. She wrote it in her own hand, in the presence of a Republican operative and a stenographer, and she signed it, and it was on the front page of every Republican daily in the country within 72 hours. Her life, she wrote, had been pure and spotless until she made his acquaintance. There was not, she wrote, and there never was, a doubt as to the paternity of our child, and the attempt of Grover Cleveland, or his friends, to couple the name of Oscar Folsom or anyone else with that boy for that purpose was simply infamous and false. She named the drugging. She named the asylum. She named Dr. King. She signed. And in her own account, which she gave to a friendly reporter later, she added a line that had haunted her from the summer of 1875. Grover Cleveland himself had said, in the presence of a witness, that he was determined to ruin her if it cost him $10,000, if it took him 20 years. He did not need 20 years. He needed 4 days. On the 4th of November, 1884, he was elected the 22nd President of the United States by a popular margin of about 23,000 votes across the whole country, roughly 0.6%, on the back of a New York state margin of about 1,200. Halpin's affidavit did not stop him. It slowed him. It cost him the aura, and it cost his party the clean sweep of the popular vote it had wanted, and it went, permanently, into the historical record of an American presidency. Maria Halpin's leverage was a single sheet of paper dropped into a campaign, and Cleveland absorbed it and went on to marry, in the White House itself, on the 2nd of June, 1886, the 21-year-old daughter of Oscar Folsom, the dead friend for whom the boy had been named. The next woman's paper would be 10 years thick, and it would run in a Washington courtroom whose doors would not close. Chapter 4. A train, a colonel, and a schoolgirl of 17. On the 1st of April, 1884, Madeline Pollard was 17 years old on the Cincinnati to Lexington train, and Colonel William Breckinridge was 47 and the finest orator in the House of Representatives. She was a small, dark-haired girl in a Wesleyan female college uniform, with a book on her lap and a fiancé waiting for her in Cincinnati, a much older merchant named Rhodes, who had been arranged for her by her uncle in a family conference the year before. She was going home for the spring break, or she was going, on another account, to a small train station in Frankfort, Kentucky, where her mother would meet her. He was a first-term Democratic congressman from Kentucky's 7th District, on his way back to his Lexington law office after the closing of a floor debate in Washington. He was 6 feet tall, silver-haired, silver-bearded, and, by every report of the congressional record, in possession of the finest speaking voice in the House. He was called, in the newspapers of 2 states, the silver-tongued orator of Kentucky. He was a widower recently remarried. He was a Presbyterian elder. He was, by blood, a Breckinridge, first cousin to the John C. Breckinridge, who had been the Vice President of the United States in the 1850s, and the Secretary of War of the Confederacy in the 1860s, and he carried the family name into every speech he gave. He was, on both his own private testimony under oath a decade later, and hers, on that morning, unknown to Madeline Pollard. She was born in Frankfort, Kentucky, in the middle of the 1860s. Her father was a struggling schoolteacher and a Confederate widower who had moved the family west to Pittsburgh, Kansas, and had died there, leaving Madeline and her mother and her siblings in genteel poverty. Small charity had come from Kentucky friends, and the small charity had put her, at 17, into a room at Wesleyan Female College in Cincinnati. She was quick. She read fast. She wrote a fair hand. She had a fiancé. She was doing what a Kentucky girl of her class was expected to do, which was to prepare herself neatly for the marriage the family had arranged. Breckinridge introduced himself. The introduction was, on both accounts, brief. He was courtly and gentle, and asked after her studies. When the train reached its Cincinnati stop, she thanked him, and he lifted his hat, and the matter, in ordinary weather, would have ended there. It did not end there. Within 2 rail journeys and 2 hotel visits, in Pollard's sworn account under cross-examination 10 years later, the colonel had made her his mistress. The seduction, she said, was rapid, and it was the seduction of a girl who did not understand what was being done to her. In his sworn account, it was different. He said, in every interview and in his own days on the stand, that the initiative had been hers. The jury believed her. So did most of the country. What is documented, beyond dispute, and in the trial exhibits, is what followed. For the next 10 years, William Breckinridge kept Madeline Pollard as his mistress in Lexington, Cincinnati, and Washington. He supported her financially. He paid her rent. He moved her at intervals from house to house, to keep the arrangement hidden from his wife, Isa Desha Breckinridge, and from the Kentucky Democratic Party. She was placed, at his suggestion and cost, at various times at Wesleyan, and then briefly at the Sayre Institute in Lexington, and then at a Catholic academy at the Sacred Heart Convent in Cincinnati. She read for her own improvement. She kept his letters. She bore him 2 children during the affair. The first was born in a house of refuge in Norwood, Ohio, and was taken from her and adopted out. The second was born in Washington, delivered by a Dr. Sophie Herzog, and was placed at the Norwood Foundling Home and died in infancy. Pollard did not raise either child. She did not, in the 10 years of the affair, live openly with the man who was its cause. She lived in boarding houses at his expense, in a rented room at 1613 20th Street Northwest in Washington for the last stretch. And she waited, and she read, and she kept his letters. And, on her sworn account, she waited on one specific promise. He had told her, from the earliest years of the affair, that when his wife Isa died, he would marry her. Isa Desha Breckinridge was 56 years old and in fragile health from the middle of the 1880s onward. She was a woman of some independent distinction, an early Kentucky advocate for the higher education of women, and Madeline Pollard's fate ran, from about 1890 onward, on the calendar of Isa Breckinridge's failing lungs. In the 9th year of the affair, on the 17th of July, 1892, Isa Breckinridge died. It was the moment Pollard had been waiting for since she was 18 years old. Her chapter with the Colonel, on his own repeated promise, was about to begin in the open. In fact, it was about to end. Chapter 5. A widow of 1 month, a marriage in a newspaper. Isa Desha Breckinridge died on the 17th of July, 1892, and Madeline Pollard, who had waited 9 years for that death, waited 9 more months and then read of another woman's engagement to William Breckinridge on the front page of a Louisville paper. She was in a small parlor in Washington when she read it. She was 26 years old. She had, on her account, spent the intervening 9 months in an assumption of quiet, in the belief that the man she had waited for since 17 was about to keep the word he had given her. He had, in her account, kept the word for 2 weeks. On the 17th of May, 1893, in a Washington room, before a witness whose social standing was as high as any in the Capitol, the wife of the sitting United States Senator from Kentucky, Julia Blackburn, William Breckinridge had, Pollard said, formally engaged himself to marry her, the marriage to occur at his convenience. Julia Blackburn's own account of that afternoon, given later under oath, agreed with Pollard's on the essential fact, though Julia Blackburn had understood the engagement as private and had not expected to be called to a witness stand about it. The engagement was, in the room, made. 10 days later, in the middle of May, William Breckinridge quietly married a widow named Louise Rhodes Wing in a Louisville parlor. Louise Wing was a Presbyterian and a Kentucky society woman and an old friend of the late Isa Desha Breckinridge, and the marriage was announced in the papers within a week. Madeline Pollard, in her Washington rooms, was the last to know. She read of it in the newspaper. She sued. It is the thing everyone in this story remembers, and it deserves to be looked at in the specific historical light in which she reached for the mechanism she used, because it was the only mechanism the Gilded Age offered her. On the 12th of August, 1893, in the Supreme Court of the District of Columbia, Madeline Pollard, through her attorneys Jer Wilson and Major Calderon Carlisle, filed a suit against William Campbell Preston Breckinridge for breach of promise to marry. She asked for $50,000 in damages, the largest such demand of the entire 19th century in the American law reports. The suit was, in one reading, an old English cause of action already ridiculed in every generation that permitted it. It was, in another reading, the one lever the coverture era had left in the hands of an unmarried woman whose life a man had spent. And it was about to be swung, at last, against a member of the Kentucky Breckinridge family, on the record, in open court, with the doors open, in Washington. Breckinridge assembled a legal team of a size that told everyone in the country how frightened he was. His lead counsel was Phil Thompson, one of the most feared cross-examiners in the American bar. His junior was Butler Wilson. And in a signal of the political stakes that has never been surpassed in an American private lawsuit, his additional counsel was the sitting Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, John G. Carlisle, on leave from his cabinet duties for the trial. Against this array, Pollard had her 2 Washington lawyers, her stack of 10 years of letters, her memory of dates and hotel rooms and doctors, and a determination that her lawyers, in later interviews, said they had never encountered before or since in a client. The winter of 1893 and the early spring of 1894 were spent in preparation. Breckinridge's team hired private detectives to canvass every city Pollard had lived in, every convent she had entered, every train she had taken, in search of a man, any man, whom she had also slept with. They found little. They believed they had, in the second of her children, an opening, and they intended to argue that the child had been fathered by another man. Pollard's team assembled her letters, all of them in chronological order, indexed them, and had them ready for the counsel table on the morning of the trial. Many of them were in Breckinridge's own hand. The country was reading the papers. The New York Herald had a stringer in Washington whose only job was the Pollard case. The Kentucky delegation in Congress had split into pro-Breckinridge and anti-Breckinridge factions. The Chautauqua Committee that had booked Breckinridge for a summer lecture tour on the sanctity of the home was, that winter, quietly reconsidering the booking. A Washington Society hostess, in a widely quoted letter to a friend in Boston, described the case as the coming spring's principal entertainment. The trial opened on the 8th of March, 1894, before Judge Andrew Bradley of the District of Columbia Supreme Court in a courtroom on Judiciary Square. Pollard's team had, in that first week, one purpose only, which was to keep their client from being cross-examined into tears by Phil Thompson. Thompson had one purpose, which was to reduce her to tears in the first hour. Pollard would take the stand on the 4th day, and she would not step down for 4 days more. Chapter 6. The doors of the courtroom would not close. The trial opened on the 8th of March, 1894, in a Washington courtroom so crowded the doors would not close, and the plaintiff took the stand on the 4th day and did not step down for 4 days more. Every seat in the small public gallery had been claimed by early morning. Every space along the walls was taken. The Kentucky congressional delegation had a reserved row. The New York Herald had a stringer at the plaintiff's counsel table, and the Washington Post had a stringer at the defense table, and the wire services were running a fresh column of copy off the Eastern Telegraph every hour. Judge Bradley had a stenographer at his elbow, and a second stenographer for the exhibits, and a third for the cross-examinations. By the 4th day, when Madeline Pollard rose from her seat at the plaintiff's table and walked in a plain, dark dress to the witness box, the doors of the courtroom would not close because of the crush of the hallway crowd outside them. She was 27 years old. She was small. She was, in every reporter's account, composed. She placed her hand on a Bible, she took the oath in a clear voice, and she began her direct testimony. It took her direct counsel 1 full afternoon to walk her through the meeting on the train in 1884, and it took a second afternoon to walk her through the 10 years that followed. She named cities. She named hotels. She named Sacred Heart Convent in Cincinnati. She named the House of Refuge in Norwood, Ohio. She named her second lying in Washington. She named the promise of May 17th, 1893, and the witness, Julia Blackburn. She spoke throughout the direct examination with the level attention of a woman who had prepared herself for the day for a year. Phil Thompson began his cross-examination on the following morning. He had a plan built around three things. He would attack her memory, item by item, on the small dates. He would attack her chastity by suggesting a series of other men, and he would attack her character by dwelling on the 2 children she had borne and not raised. He worked at her, in the room, for 3 full days. She did not break. On the last afternoon of her cross-examination, she was asked by Thompson whether she thought it fair that her suit should ruin an old man in his old age. She was asked on his account, by a Sacred Heart nun she had known in Cincinnati, whether she truly meant to do such a thing. She looked at Thompson and she answered him, "Why on earth do you want to ruin that poor old man in his old age?" Thompson said the nun had asked her. She had asked the nun a question in return. She said, "Why should that poor old man have wanted to ruin me in my youth?" She was asked whether she took any responsibility for what had happened. She said, in a sentence that ran in every wire report of the trial, "I will take my share of the blame. I only ask that he take his." On the morning of the 6th of April, 1894, her counsel introduced the 10 years of letters. They had been assembled in ribbon-tied bundles across the winter of preparation. A large share of them were in Breckinridge's own hand. They were laid on the plaintiff's counsel table in slow motions of the clerk, and Judge Bradley called a recess to let the defense counsel examine them. The letters were love letters. They were money letters. They were letters of instruction about the hiding of a pregnancy. They were, in one of the exhibits that would run in the papers as the single most damaging document of the trial, a letter from William Breckinridge to Madeline Pollard, dated in the spring of 1892, in which he informed her that his wife was dying and that he expected soon to be able to keep the promise he had given her. That exhibit, that letter, is the reason Madeline Pollard won the suit. Breckinridge himself took the stand across 2 separate days of the trial. He was, on the stand, the man he had been at the podium of the House of Representatives, dignified, low-voiced, courteous, patrician. He denied, at length, the seduction. He denied, at length, the promise of marriage. He was asked at length about the letters. He was asked at the end of his examination whether he considered himself to have behaved honorably toward the young woman at the plaintiff's table. He looked at her for a long time. He answered, in a low voice that ran on every wire that afternoon and haunted him for the rest of his life, that he had wronged this poor girl greatly. Judge Bradley delivered his charge to the jury the following day. The jury retired that afternoon and returned to the courtroom in the evening, having deliberated less than 4 hours. The foreman was on his feet. The verdict was for the plaintiff in the sum of $15,000, roughly $480,000 of the money of our time. William Breckinridge, who had entered the courtroom for the last day in the black frock coat he had worn on the floor of the House for a decade, walked out into the Washington twilight without speaking to a reporter. He appealed. The appeal failed. He returned to Kentucky, and he ran for renomination in the 7th District in the summer of 1894. He stumped the district for 6 weeks. He gave, in Lexington and in Louisville and in every county seat, the finest speeches of his political life. And, in November, he lost the primary and then the general, and he lost the seat he had held for a decade to a Republican decisively. He returned to Lexington and to the editorial page of the Lexington Morning Herald, where he wrote until his death in 1904. He never returned to Congress. Madeline Pollard collected her $15,000. She had won. Her paper was 10 years of a congressman's own handwriting and a jury verdict on a Washington afternoon, and it had taken his seat, though it had not taken his family or his fortune. The next woman's paper would try to take everything. Chapter 7. A rented room at the Grand Hotel and a signature. Sarah Althea Hill was 30 and short of money, and in August of 1880 moved into room 40 of the Grand Hotel in San Francisco at the invitation of the United States Senator from Nevada. She was small, blonde, exceedingly pretty in every photograph, and she was, by every account of her Nob Hill acquaintances, quick, sharp-tongued, and impossible to command. She had been born in 1850 in Cape Girardeau County, Missouri, into a prosperous slaveholding family, and she had been orphaned young and raised by a wealthy uncle in San Francisco. She had inherited money and had gambled it heavily on Comstock mining stocks. In the boom years, she had done well. In the bust years, she had lost it all. In the summer of 1880, she was, in the plain phrase her Nob Hill friends used of her among themselves, on the market. The United States Senator from Nevada was William Sharon, 60 years old, widowed, one of the 10 richest men in America, the king of the Comstock. He had come out of Ohio to California in the 1850s, had gone to Nevada in the 1860s as the Bank of California's Comstock agent, and had, in the 20 years that followed, made the fortune of a lifetime out of a silver strike under a mountain. His holdings included the Union Mill and Mining Company, the Ophir Mine, the Belcher Mine, the Bank of California, and the finest hotel on the Pacific Slope, the Palace Hotel on Market Street in San Francisco, of which he was the proprietor. He kept apartments in the palace. His wife had been dead since 1875. He had a mistress in the East, a woman named Gertrude Dietz. He had been the junior United States Senator from Nevada from 1875 until the 1881 election. In the summer of 1880, at 60, he was quietly in the market for a companion in San Francisco. The arrangement was made in the corridors of the Grand Hotel, next door to the palace. Sharon installed Sarah Althea Hill in room 40 of the Grand and paid her rent at $500 a month, roughly $14,000 of the money of our time. It was the standard rate for a Nob Hill kept woman, and it was, in San Francisco, an entirely ordinary arrangement between an entirely ordinary older millionaire and an entirely ordinary younger woman. It was to become the least ordinary of the 4 cases in this film, because 5 days into it, on the 25th of August, 1880, or on the 20th, the record disagrees. William Sharon, on Sarah Althea Hill's later account under oath, signed a written declaration of marriage with her, drafted at her request, sworn her to secrecy for 2 years, and hid the paper in a private drawer. He denied, ever after, that he had signed it. Understand what she was asking him to sign, because it is the reason the whole rest of her life turned on a single sheet of writing. The California Civil Code, in a peculiar provision at Section 55, enacted in 1872 and unique among American state laws of its moment, allowed a marriage to be contracted by mutual written declaration between parties otherwise free to marry, without a religious ceremony, without a public notice, without a magistrate. The written declaration, once signed and dated, was, under California law, a valid marriage. The provision had been intended for the frontier, where a wandering minister was often 100 miles away, and it was still on the books in 1880. If William Sharon had signed such a declaration, and if it could be produced, Sarah Althea Hill was, at law, his wife, and half of every dollar Sharon had made from the 25th of August, 1880, was, on the community property rules of California, hers. She had, or said she had, exactly such a paper. She kept it in her handbag. She would carry it, in the years to come, into courtroom after courtroom. Sharon kept her for over 2 years. She lived at the Grand, and, when he tired of the Grand, in a house on Ellis Street he paid for. Then, in the late autumn of 1883, he tired of her. He tried, on her account, to buy her out. He offered her, in one interview she gave later, $7,500 for the return and destruction of the marriage contract. She refused. She insisted, in her own person and in her own hand, that she was his wife. When she would not go, he sent Palace Hotel staff over to her rooms with a work crew, and the work crew pulled the hinges off her door and put Sarah Althea Hill and her possessions on the pavement outside. She hired a lawyer. Her lawyer was a flamboyant San Francisco trial man named George Tyler, who took the case for a share of the eventual settlement and put a small army of investigators to work in San Francisco within a fortnight. In September of 1883, she filed a suit in the California State Court seeking divorce, alimony, and half of everything William Sharon had made since the 25th of August, 1880, which at the time was reliably estimated at somewhere between $15 and $20 million, or roughly 500 to 700 million of the money of today. Sharon countersued in federal court to have the marriage contract declared a forgery. 2 lawsuits now ran in parallel, in 2 courts, on the same piece of paper. The paper was in Sarah Althea Hill's handbag, and the 6-year war for one of the 10 largest fortunes in America had begun. Chapter 8. A California courtroom, a Nevada senator, and half a Comstock fortune. Judge Jeremiah Sullivan of the California District Court declared Sarah Althea Hill the legal wife of William Sharon on the 24th of December, 1884, awarded her half of everything he had made in 5 years, and William Sharon lived on for 11 more months. It had taken Judge Sullivan 14 months from the filing to the decree. He had heard, in that time, 6 weeks of trial testimony. He had received the marriage contract in evidence, listened to a handwriting expert testify that the signature was William Sharon's, listened to a second expert testify that it was not, and, in a long written opinion, decided the question for Sarah Althea Hill. He declared her Sharon's wife. He granted her a decree of divorce. He awarded her a share of the community property acquired since the 25th of August, 1880, and he set her alimony at $2,500 a month, roughly $70,000 of the money of today. On the 24th of December, 1884, Sarah Althea Hill, 34 years old, was, at California law, the wife of the richest man in California and entitled to half of 5 years of a Comstock silver fortune. Sharon did not pay. He appealed. He continued in the meantime the parallel federal action, which was moving on a slower calendar in the United States Circuit Court in San Francisco. On the 13th of November, 1885, before either appeal was resolved, William Sharon died at the Palace Hotel of a chronic condition, not of anything violent. He was 64 years old. His son, Frederick Sharon, and his executors, on his instructions in his will, took over the fight. 2 years passed in appellate paperwork. Sarah Althea Hill, in the meantime, had reached, in her way, for a further weapon. In November of 1886, she had married her lead California trial attorney, a man 27 years her senior, former Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, David Terry, and had made him her advocate and, in his own reading, her legal husband and her heir. David Terry was a Kentucky-born Confederate veteran, a fabled California lawyer of the middle 19th century, and most famously, the man who had killed a sitting United States Senator, David C. Broderick, in a duel at Lake Merced in September 1859. Terry had, at the time of his marriage to Sarah Althea Hill, 1 dead senator to his name. He would, in the years to come, add one dead California Chief Justice in the person of himself, though he did not yet know it. The federal case moved to its decision. On the 3rd of September, 1888, in a packed federal courtroom in San Francisco, United States Supreme Court Justice Stephen J. Field, sitting on his federal circuit assignment, delivered the final federal opinion. The marriage contract, Justice Field ruled, was a forgery. The Sullivan Decree, and every California state ruling flowing from it, was void. Sarah Althea Hill had no lawful claim on the Sharon estate. In the room, at the counsel table, Sarah Althea Hill was on her feet before the last sentence of the opinion had left Justice Field's mouth. She screamed at him. "Are you going to take the money?" she said, "and let that woman have my share?" She was reaching, in the same motion, into her handbag for a small revolver. She had the revolver in her hand when the United States Marshal for the Northern District of California, a man named John Franks, reached her from behind and caught her arm. David Terry, seated beside her, rose. He drew a Bowie knife from beneath his coat. He struck Marshal Franks, knocked out one of his teeth, and continued to strike him until 3 courthouse deputies pulled him back. Justice Field, in his black robe, in the elevated bench, watched the whole scene without moving. He remanded husband and wife to the custody of the marshal. Terry was held in contempt of federal court and sentenced to 6 months in the Alameda County Jail. Hill was held in contempt and sentenced to 30 days. She served the 30 days. Terry served the 6 months. They emerged from Alameda County Jail in the spring of 1889 with a public and repeated vow to kill Justice Field on sight. The Attorney General of the United States and the President, Benjamin Harrison, took the vow at face value and authorized a permanent federal bodyguard for a sitting Supreme Court justice, in what would become one of the foundational instances of the doctrine of federal protective power. The bodyguard was a United States Deputy Marshal named David Neagle. Justice Field returned to his summer circuit ride in the western states in the summer of 1889, with Deputy Neagle in the next seat and a loaded revolver in Neagle's coat pocket. On the 14th of August, 1889, at 7:10 in the morning, at a railway breakfast stop in the Central Valley of California, at the little station of Lathrop, Justice Field and Deputy Neagle stepped off a northbound train to eat. So did David and Sarah Althea Terry, who had, by coincidence, been on the same train. They met, all 4 of them, in the dining room. And the 4 seconds that followed are the single most concentrated set piece in this whole film, and they belong, in the telling, to their own chapter. Chapter 9. A dining room at Lathrop and a coffin she pulled through the streets. On the 14th of August, 1889, at 7:10 in the morning, David Terry walked up to Justice Field at a breakfast stop in the Central Valley and slapped him twice in the face, and Deputy Marshal David Neagle drew his pistol and killed him with a bullet to the heart. It was over in the length of a held breath. Justice Field, at the small round dining table in the Lathrop Railway restaurant, had a cup of coffee in front of him and a folded morning paper beside it. His fork was in his right hand. Deputy Neagle, standing behind Field's right shoulder, saw David Terry cross the room and register the justice at the table. Neagle saw Terry's face. He saw the slap. He saw the second slap. He saw Terry's right hand move inside the front of his coat in the motion of a man reaching for a weapon at his belt. Neagle did not wait to see the weapon. He drew, and he fired, twice, at close range. The first bullet took David Terry through the heart. The second was in the wall behind him before Terry hit the floor. Sarah Althea. Terry had been at the counter buying a piece of pastry. She heard the 2 shots. She turned. She saw her husband on the wooden floor of a railway restaurant in a small California town, with a federal bullet through his chest. She screamed once, ran to him, knelt in his blood, and would not let go of him. Deputy Neagle stood over the body with his revolver still in his hand. Justice Field, at the table, had not moved. She was arrested at Lathrop for making an assault on a federal officer. Neagle was arrested for the murder. Neagle was released on a federal writ of habeas corpus within the week, on the theory that a federal officer acting under color of federal duty could not be tried in a state court for an act taken in the course of that duty. The case, in Re Neagle, 135 United States Reports 1, went, in the ordinary course, to the Supreme Court of the United States, and was decided on the 14th of April, 1890, in favor of the federal government. It established, as constitutional doctrine, the inherent authority of the President of the United States to protect federal officers under laws implicit in the Constitution. It is one of the foundational federal executive power cases still read in every American law school. Its factual predicate is a dining room in a small station in the Central Valley of California, and a woman in a bloodied dress kneeling beside her husband's body. Sarah Althea Terry, in the months that followed, unraveled. She had been arrested at Lathrop, tried and acquitted on the assault charge, and released. She spent the winter of 1889 and the spring of 1890 in San Francisco and in Stockton, in the small circle of Terry's friends, who would still see her, moving from address to address, in the company, at various stages, of a lawyer she had retained to keep the Sharon appellate case alive, and of a private nurse retained by her friends to watch her. She began, in the summer of 1890, to walk the streets of Stockton behind a coffin on a wagon. She had convinced herself that the coffin contained the body of David Terry, that he had not died at Lathrop, that he was still alive inside it, and that if she walked the coffin around the town long enough, he would come out. Terry had, in fact, been buried in Stockton months earlier, in a plot she herself had chosen. The coffin she was walking behind, on the accounts of the townspeople who watched her pass, was empty. She would stop pedestrians, tell them her husband was alive, and ask them to help her open the box. She kept up the walks, at intervals, into the winter. In March of 1892, on the petition of the old San Francisco friends, who could no longer look after her, a County Lunacy Commission of California met, reviewed the record, and committed Sarah Althea Terry, now aged 41, to the Stockton State Asylum for the Insane. She had, in the 2 years since Lathrop, spent time in her right mind and time out of it. She would spend, in the state institution at Stockton, the last 45 years of her life. She would sign her letters, when she wrote them, in the same hand that had signed the marriage contract in 1880, with the name Sarah Althea Hill Terry Sharon. She would tell every visiting reporter, in the calm periods, that she was Mrs. Sharon and had always been Mrs. Sharon. She lived in the asylum through the McKinley and Roosevelt and Taft and Wilson and Harding administrations. She lived through the 2 administrations of the man Maria Holpin had helped make president. She lived through the deaths of every person named in this chapter except herself. She died at Stockton State Hospital on Valentine's Day, the 14th of February 1937, at the age of 86. Her grave in Stockton Rural Cemetery is unmarked to this day. Her paper had become a doctrine on the constitutional law syllabus and a body on a train platform, and had left her 45 years in a state institution. The last woman's paper would come after the man's death, and would outlive her own. Chapter 10. A Marion, Ohio girl, and a photograph on a bedroom wall. Nan Britton was still in her teens when she pinned the first photograph of Warren Harding to her bedroom wall in Marion, Ohio, and 20 when she wrote to United States Senator Warren Harding in Washington to ask for help finding a job. She was born on the 9th of November, 1896, in the small town of Clarendon, Ohio, and moved as an infant to Marion, the county seat, where her father, Samuel Britton, was one of the town's 2 respected physicians. Samuel Britton was a family friend of the Hardings. The 2 houses were 4 blocks apart. Warren Harding, in the middle years of Nan Britton's childhood, was the editor and publisher of the Marion Daily Star, a handsome, well-spoken man in his 40s, moving through Ohio Republican politics at the local, county, and eventually state level, with a wife named Florence Kling, who ran the newspaper's circulation department with the discipline of a bank clerk. Nan Britton, in those teenage years, developed the crush a small-town doctor's daughter develops on the handsomest man in the town. She pinned a photograph of Warren Harding, cut from a campaign flyer, to her bedroom wall. She pinned a second. She pinned a third. Her mother, on Nan Britton's own account in her book, teased her for it and eventually took the photographs down. Nan Britton pinned new ones. It was, in her retelling, an entirely ordinary teenage fixation on a local celebrity. And Warren Harding, who paid social calls at the Britton house and treated Nan with the affable warmth of a family friend, never quite noticed and enjoyed it. Dr. Samuel Britton died in 1913. Nan was 16. The family's finances, which had been comfortable, became precarious. Nan Britton finished at Marion High School the following spring and, in 1916, at 19, was sent by her mother to New York to attend a secretarial school. She wrote regularly to her mother. She wrote once to Warren Harding, who was then the freshly elected United States Senator from Ohio in Washington. Her letter asked, in polite and formal terms, whether he might help her find a position as a stenographer in a New York office. Harding replied by hand. He said he would help. He said he would be in New York in the spring. He would take her to lunch. He signed warmly in the manner of a hometown friend. He met her in New York in May, or possibly in June of 1917. He was 51, she was 20. He took her to lunch. He took her, after lunch, to a room at the Manhattan Hotel in New York. On the account she gave under her own signature in her book of 1927, in a chapter she had prepared for a decade to write, Warren Harding became her lover that afternoon. It was the beginning of a 6-year affair. It ran, on her account, through the Manhattan Hotel in New York, the LaSalle in Chicago, and various hotels in Washington. It ran, from 1917 through 1920, through the office of the United States Senator in the Senate Office Building on Capitol Hill, where Harding kept the door locked in the afternoon hours and the outer secretary discreet, and where Nan Britton, who had by now moved from her secretarial school to a small New York apartment, would arrive on the train from Pennsylvania Station, at his instruction, once a fortnight, for the length of an afternoon. She bore him a child in the 2nd year of the affair. The daughter, Elizabeth Ann Britton, was born on the 22nd of October 1919 in a rented house in Asbury Park, New Jersey, that Harding had leased for the confinement. Nan Britton was 22. Warren Harding was 53, still a sitting United States Senator, and would, in the following autumn, become the Republican Party's nominee for the presidency of the United States. He was elected on the 2nd of November, 1920, in the largest landslide of any presidential election since 1820. Nan Britton, in her Asbury Park rooms, with her 13-month-old daughter in a crib beside her, read of the election on the front page of a New York morning paper. He never met the daughter. He paid, in the whole 6 years of the affair, in cash, in envelopes carried by his Marion valet, brother-in-law, and Secret Service agent Jim Sloan, who traveled from Marion to New York and from Washington to Asbury Park on a regular quarterly schedule, with an envelope in his coat pocket. The envelopes were small. Britton would count them at her kitchen table. She would put half aside for the baby. She would spend the other half on the small apartment and, in the harder months, on food. And she would wait on Warren Harding's promise for the eventual arrangement he had told her, from the earliest months of the affair, he would someday make. On the 2nd of August, 1923, at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco, on the last stop of a Western presidential tour, Warren Harding died. He was 57 years old. He had complained of chest pains for a week. There was no autopsy. His attending physicians called it apoplexy, in the ordinary phrase of the era for a sudden cardiac event. His body was carried back to Washington by rail, and from Washington to Marion in the largest funeral procession the American 19th or 20th century had ever staged for a president. Nan Britton read of the death, on the account she gave in her book, on a subway platform in New York in an early edition of the Herald. The envelopes from Marion on the ordinary quarterly schedule did not arrive in the autumn of 1923. Chapter 11. A hotel room in San Francisco and the day the envelopes stopped. The president died at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco on the 2nd of August, 1923, of what the doctors called apoplexy, and the small monthly envelopes that had come from Marion to Nan Britton stopped in the same week. She was 26. Her daughter was 3. She had, in the small New York apartment she had lived in since the birth of the child, very little money and a rent bill due at the end of the month. She had, in a locked drawer in her bedroom, a folder of paper. She had a certain number of Harding's letters she had, in defiance of his repeated request, kept and hidden. She had hotel receipts. She had a set of memos from Jim Sloan on hotel stationery, small notes in the valet's careful hand, recording the delivery of envelopes on given dates. She had her own memory. She had, most of all, the fact that on the 22nd of October, 1919, in a house in Asbury Park, New Jersey, she had borne a child whose father was the 29th President of the United States, and she had a photograph of that child in a small silver frame on her bedside table. She went, in the first weeks after the death, to the Harding family. She went to Warren Harding's brother, Dr. George T. Harding, a physician in Ohio. She went, in a separate visit, to Warren Harding's sister, Daisy Harding Lewis. She asked, on her account and on theirs, for a small monthly settlement for Elizabeth Ann's schooling. She asked for an acknowledgement that Elizabeth Ann was Warren Harding's daughter. She got, from the Harding family, sporadic small sums and no acknowledgement. She was told more than once that she should never again present herself at the family's house in Marion. She was refused any share of Warren Harding's estate. She was refused, above all, the acknowledgement she had come for. Florence Kling Harding, the widow, was, in the meantime, doing the second thing that would make Nan Britton's book possible. She was burning her husband's papers. She had come home to Marion, in the autumn of 1923, with a small trunk of documents from the White House residence and a stated intention to preserve her husband's reputation. She sat in her library over the winter of 1923 and the spring of 1924, and she burned, systematically, every letter, memo, telegram, and hotel receipt she could reach. She burned the entirety of Warren Harding's presidential personal correspondence. She burned, according to accounts, over a full trunk of his business papers. She did the thing rich widows in this film have done in every case, which is to try to make sure that after the man was dead, nothing survived that a woman like Nan Britton could hold up to the light. She had underestimated the shape of the problem. She was burning her husband's paper. Nan Britton had her own. Florence Harding died in 1924. Nan Britton, in New York, spent the following 2 years thinking. She took, at intervals, work as a secretary. She took, briefly, work as a fashion copywriter at a New York millinery. She moved twice into smaller apartments. She was, by the summer of 1926, alone with a small child and no income, except what she could earn week to week. She began to write. The book she wrote across the winter of 1926 and the spring of 1927 was 380 pages long. She wrote it in a small notebook, in a longhand that got faster and less careful as she went. She titled it, in the third draft, The President's Daughter. She dedicated it, in a plain sentence on the front matter, to the unwed mothers of America and their innocent children. The book named names. It named dates. It named the Manhattan Hotel and the LaSalle in Chicago and the Willard in Washington. It named the office of the United States Senator in the Senate Office Building, and it described the closing of the outer door and the drawing of the inner curtain. It named, in a single paragraph in the third chapter, that after the November 1920 election, when Warren Harding was the president-elect of the United States, he had received her in a coat closet next to the cabinet room in the west wing of the White House, a closet no larger than the ordinary linen closet, and had made love to her there for the last time. She could not find a publisher. Every trade publisher in New York and every publisher in Boston, and the two she wrote to in Philadelphia, refused the manuscript. It was too dangerous. It was too vulgar. It was too improbable. It would be the target, they told her in identical letters, of a libel action from the Harding family or the Republican Party the day it appeared. She retained a Cleveland attorney named James McKee, who had known her father in Ohio, and she formed a small company under the name the Elizabeth Ann Guild, incorporated in New York in the early months of 1927. The Elizabeth Ann Guild would publish The President's Daughter itself. It hired a printing house on West 26th Street in New York, on 26th Street between 6th and 7th Avenues, and, in the summer of 1927, it laid down the plates. Chapter 12. The Police, the Plates, and a Laboratory 92 years late. John Sumner of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice arranged with the New York City Police Department to raid Britain's printing house in 1927, and the police walked out in the afternoon with the unbound sheets and the zinc plates under their arms. Sumner was the successor to Anthony Comstock at the New York Vice Society, a lawyer who had spent his career bringing obscenity prosecutions against New York booksellers and theater owners. He had been tipped by an unknown source that the Elizabeth Ann Guild was about to publish a book whose contents would corrupt the morals of the young. He obtained a warrant. He arrived at the West 26th Street printing house in the afternoon, in the company of officers of the New York City Police Department. He served the warrant. He directed the officers to load the unbound sheets, all of them, and the zinc plates from which the sheets had been printed, all of them, onto the police wagons in the street outside. Nan Britton was there. She stood in the doorway of the shop and watched. Nan Britton did not weep. She telephoned her lawyer. James McKee filed within days for the return of the seized property on the theory that the warrant was defective and that the material seized was not, in law, obscene. He won. The New York City Police Department, on the order of the court, returned to the West 26th Street printing house and unloaded, from the same wagons that had removed them, the sheets and the plates of The President's Daughter. The Elizabeth Ann Guild bound the first run of the book and began to ship it. In its lifetime, the book sold roughly 90,000 copies at $5, roughly 100 of the money of today per copy, and it gave Nan Britton and her daughter their livelihood. The book was reviewed, and most of the reviews were savage. The New York World called it a fabrication. The mainstream American press either dismissed it or refused to notice it. The one voice that spoke for it in the whole small chorus of the American press of 1927 was H. L. Mencken, who called Nan Britton, in his characteristic phrase, a poor devil, and treated the reviewers as fools. Frederick Lewis Allen, 4 years later, in the last chapter of his History of the 1920s, would write of the book in the most damning summary in the whole American historical literature on Warren Harding, that one was struck by the shabbiness of the whole affair, the clandestine meetings in disreputable hotels, in the Senate office building, and even in a coat closet in the executive offices of the White House itself. That coat closet, and every other specific claim in the book, remained, for the mainstream American historical consensus, unproven for the next 88 years. Francis Russell's biography of Warren Harding, The Shadow of Blooming Grove, published in 1968, treated Nan Britton as a sad and deluded woman who had believed the wrong things about the wrong man. The standard textbook accounts of the Harding administration through the middle of the 20th century either ignored the book or dismissed it. Elizabeth Ann Britton, who had, on Nan Britton's own instructions in the book, grown up believing that Nan Britton's sister Elizabeth was her mother and that Nan was her aunt, married a Chicago man named Henry Blasing in 1938, moved to the Midwest, raised her own family, and, in her adult life, never gave a press interview. She died in Oregon in October 2005 at the age of 86. Nan Britton herself sued, in the years after the book's publication, the Judge Charles Pettyjohn, who had led an Ohio criminal libel action against her, and she was countersued and exhausted, legally, in a 2-year proceeding that consumed most of her book earnings after 1929. She published a second book, Honesty or Politics, in 1932, a follow-up defending the first. It sold poorly. She retreated, by the middle of the 1930s, into a quiet Illinois life. She ran a small secretarial business. She ran, briefly, a printing shop, in the same New York where the police had seized her plates. She married once, in 1954, briefly. She died in Evanston, Illinois, on the 21st of March, 1991, of natural causes, at the age of 94. She had, in a life of 94 years, spent 64 of them living with a public reputation as a woman who had lied about a president. On the 12th of August, 2015, the New York Times ran, on its front page, a story reporting that Ancestry, the commercial DNA testing service, had established, from the descendants of Elizabeth Ann Blasing and the descendants of Warren Harding's collateral relatives, that Warren Gamaliel Harding was, as a matter of statistical certainty, the biological father of Elizabeth Ann Blasing. Every specific claim of paternity in the president's daughter, from a 1927 book seized by the New York City police and dismissed by the mainstream American historical profession for 88 years, had been confirmed. The confirmation came 92 years after the affair had opened in a hotel room in Manhattan, and 34 years after Nan Britton had died in a small Illinois town. Her paper was a hardcover book seized by the police, sued back, sold, and confirmed by a laboratory 92 years after she opened it. The other 3 women had left affidavits, letters, and a marriage contract on the shelves of history, and the shelves of history had not opened them. Chapter 13. The monuments that survived, and the graves that did not. A century later, 3 of the men in this story are still on the wall of the Capitol Rotunda, and 3 of the women are in unmarked graves. Grover Cleveland is on the wall of the Capitol Rotunda in the official portrait of the 22nd and the 24th President of the United States. The Cleveland grandchildren carry his name in the American genealogical record. There is a candy bar named for his daughter Ruth, born to his wedded wife, Frances Folsom, in 1891. 5 years after the wedding of Frances Folsom, to the man Maria Halpin had signed her affidavit against. The wedding was, and remains, the only wedding of a sitting president inside the walls of the White House. Maria Halpin is in a cemetery plot in Chautauqua County, New York, that carries no marker with her name on it. The best current historical work on her, Charles Lockman's A Secret Life, appeared in 2011, 108 years after her death. The candy bar is still in the stores. The plot is still unmarked. William Breckinridge has a statue in Lexington, Kentucky, though the statue has, across the 20th century, been shifted into progressively less public rooms. The Breckinridge family remains one of the great Kentucky family names, and the descendants of William Breckinridge are still active in Kentucky politics and Kentucky business. Madeleine Pollard is in a grave, probably in England, whose exact location the modern historical record has lost. The best current work on her, Patricia Miller's Bringing Down the Colonel, appeared in 2018, 124 years after the trial that made her famous. The statue in Lexington has been moved. Pollard's grave has not been found. The Palace Hotel, William Sharon, built on Market Street, stands today, rebuilt after the 1906 earthquake and fire, one of the great San Francisco luxury hotels. The Comstock silver he pulled from the mountain has been spent for 140 years in the buildings of San Francisco, in the Bank of California, in the Union Mill and Mining Company, in the fortunes of his son Frederick and Frederick's descendants. Sarah Althea Hill is in an unmarked grave in Stockton Rural Cemetery. She lived in Stockton State Asylum for 45 years after her leverage failed her, and she died on Valentine's Day, 1937, at the age of 86. And the cemetery workers who buried her did not, on the record of the plot, know exactly which small figure they were laying down. The Palace Hotel is on Market Street. Her grave has no headstone. Warren Gamaliel Harding is buried in Marion, Ohio, at the memorial the town raised for him. The Marion, Ohio Harding Home Museum is a small state historical site. Nan Britton is in a plot in a Chicago suburb, whose exact grave number is not on any public database. She was 94 years old when she died, and she had spent 64 of those years living with a public reputation as a woman who had lied about a president, and she died 24 years before the laboratory finding that would have made her right. 3 of the 4 women, on the plainest reading of the record that survives, are in graves without their names on them. 3 of the 4 men have monuments on which their names are carved in stone. That is the gap the whole film has been trying to see. It is not, in the end, the gap between rich and poor. All 4 of the women in this film came from families that were, in their own generation, at least modestly comfortable. And every one of them, at one point or another, had reason to believe that she could hold her own with the man she had chosen, or the man who had chosen her. The gap is the gap between whose paper the century would file and whose paper it would burn. Cleveland's presidential papers are in the Library of Congress. Halpin's affidavit is a rare pamphlet in a few research libraries, and was, until the 2011 biography, in most textbook accounts of Cleveland, unmentioned. Breckinridge's congressional record speeches are on every American library shelf. Pollard's trial transcript is in the Huntington Library and the Library of Congress and is read by graduate students. Sharon's business papers are in the California Historical Society. Hill's asylum file is not open. Harding's official presidential papers are in the Library of Congress in Marion. Britton's book is in second-hand paperback on the shelf of every used bookstore that has a shelf for the 1920s. The record is uneven because the century preserved the men's papers and left the women's to survive by accident. And they did survive, all 4 of them, by accident, and by their author's stubbornness. Halpin's affidavit exists because she signed it in 1884, and the Republican press printed it. Pollard's letters exist because a young law clerk catalogued them for 48 hours in the winter of 1894, and Judge Bradley received them in evidence. Hill's marriage contract exists in the appellate exhibits of Sharon versus Sharon. The paper itself lost, but the reproduction preserved. Britton's book exists because James McKee sued for its return in the autumn of 1927 and won. Each paper survived one specific hostile moment because one specific person, in most cases the woman herself, insisted on it. Without those 4 insistences, none of these stories would be tellable at all, which is the harshest fact of the film. The record we are working from is the record that survived the men who tried to destroy it. Chapter 14. The paper always came due. 4 papers, 4 women, 4 fortunes, and 1 silence that turned out never to have been sold, only borrowed. Maria Halpin's paper was a 2-page affidavit sworn in a Buffalo parlor on the last day of October, 1884. She had signed it for free. She had signed it in her own hand, in front of a Republican operative and a stenographer. And she had signed it because a Baptist minister had, 3 months earlier, printed her name in a Buffalo newspaper and unmade her small, quiet New Rochelle life. And she had realized, on the strength of 9 years of thinking, that the $500 she had signed for in the summer of 1875 had never been a purchase at all. It had been a loan, and she had called the loan due. Grover Cleveland became the 22nd President of the United States by 1,200 votes in the state of New York, and Maria Halpin died 16 years later in Chautauqua County in a small house with 3 older children around her. Madeline Pollard's paper was 10 years of a congressman's own handwriting, a large share of them in Breckinridge's own hand, laid out on the plaintiff's counsel table in Judge Bradley's Washington courtroom on the morning of the 6th of April, 1894. She had kept every letter. She had kept them, over the 10 years of the affair, in a black cloth binder she carried between boarding houses. She had, on her lawyer's instruction, indexed them in her own hand the winter before the trial. William Breckinridge, on the witness stand, was asked whether he considered himself to have behaved honorably toward the young woman at the plaintiff's table, and after a long look, he answered, in his silver-toned voice, that he had wronged this poor girl greatly, and it is the sentence he is now most remembered for, because his own letters had made it impossible for him to say anything else. Madeline Pollard collected $15,000 in April of 1894 and boarded a steamer for England in the summer of 1895, and the record of the rest of her life is thin. Sarah Althea Hill's paper was a single sheet of writing dated the 25th of August, 1880, bearing or purporting to bear the signature of the United States Senator from Nevada. She had carried it for 6 years in her handbag. She had carried it on the 3rd of September, 1888, into the federal courtroom of Justice Stephen J. Field in San Francisco, and she had reached for it when the ruling came down against her. With the same hand, she was already reaching into her purse to draw a small revolver. She had, on the 14th of August, 1889, on a railway platform in the Central Valley of California, watched her second husband die with a federal bullet through his heart, and she had, from March of 1892 until her death on Valentine's Day, 1937, 45 years later, lived in a state institution in Stockton, where she signed her letters with the 4 names she believed she had earned. She died alone at 86. Her paper is on the constitutional law syllabus at every American law school as in re Neagle, in a footnote of no particular length. Nan Britton's paper was a 380-page book printed on West 26th Street in New York in the summer of 1927, seized by the New York City Police Department on a summer afternoon, and sued back by a Cleveland lawyer in the same month, published in the autumn, sold in 90,000 copies at $5, denounced by every mainstream American newspaper except one, dismissed by every American historian of the middle 20th century, and confirmed on the front page of the New York Times on the 12th of August, 2015, by a laboratory test on the DNA of her descendants. She had been dead for 24 years. Her daughter had been dead for 10. The confirmation came 92 years after the summer afternoon on which she had walked into the Manhattan Hotel with a 51-year-old United States Senator from Ohio. She had spent 64 of her 94 years knowing what a laboratory would one day prove. 4 papers, 4 women, 4 men who had believed that a rich man could always buy a woman's silence and had, in every one of the 4 cases, been asked to reconsider. Cleveland was reconsidered by 0.6% of the popular vote in November of 1884. Breckinridge was reconsidered by his own Kentucky Democratic Party in the summer of 1894 at the primary, and by the voters of the 7th District in the general in November. Sharon was reconsidered by Judge Sullivan of the California District Court on Christmas Eve of 1884, and reconsidered again by Justice Field in the Federal Circuit in September of 1888, and reconsidered a 3rd time in the Supreme Court in the Neagle case in April of 1890, and had by then been dead almost 5 years. Harding was reconsidered by a commercial DNA laboratory in the summer of 2015. In every one of the 4 cases, the reconsideration was public. In 3 of the 4, it landed on the man's own biographical entry in the encyclopedias. In the 4th, it landed on the DNA of his own descendants. You could sit tonight in the reading rooms of any of 5 great American libraries and pull down, from the shelves the historians have kept, 4 small folders: the Halpin affidavit, the Pollard trial transcript, the Sharon appellate exhibits, the 1927 Elizabeth Ann Gilded edition of The President's Daughter, 4 folders, 4 women's papers, 4 Gilded Age fortunes that a rich man believed a woman's signature could be bought against, and that a woman's signature, in the end, could not. Return, at the last, to the small blonde woman in the front row of the federal courtroom in San Francisco on the 3rd of September, 1888, with a marriage contract in one hand and a revolver in the other. She had 30 seconds left of the 6-year fight she had been the whole architect of. She had, at that moment, done every one of the things any of the 4 women in this film had done. She had signed for the money, taken the money, refused the money, taken the man to court, married her lawyer, buried her enemy, and reached in the end for the last argument. In 30 seconds, Marshall Franks would take her arm and David Terry would draw a Bowie knife. She would, in her own way, live for another 45 years. Her paper would go into the constitutional law reports. Her husband would go into the ground. She would go into Stockton State Asylum. But at that moment, at 3 in the afternoon of the 3rd of September, 1888, standing on the polished pine of a federal courtroom, she was, for the last time, exactly what she had told Justice Field and the whole American press and William Sharon's 4,000 employees, and Gertrude Dietz and the 12 reporters and the 200 spectators in the room she was, which was the wife of the king of the Comstock. She was Mrs. Sharon. She always would be. Madeline Pollard, on the 7th day of her cross-examination in Judge Bradley's Washington courtroom in April of 1894, was asked one last time by Phil Thompson why she had brought a suit that could only bring pain to an old man's reputation. And she gave, in her level voice, the sentence that closes the film. "I will take my share of the blame. I only ask that he take his." That is what the 4 papers, in the end, were for. Before you go, subscribe and keep the light on for these women, because there are more of them, and I will bring them here one by one. And in the comments below, tell me, of the 4 papers in tonight's film, which one you think was worth the price the woman paid for it? Halpin's affidavit, Pollard's letters, Hill's marriage contract, Britton's book. I want to hear which one, and I want to hear why.